Okay, welcome everyone. We are recording this session, so I just got that started now. And I want to welcome you to the workshop called The Value of Inclusion and Accessibility in Environmental and Sustainability Education. I'm so pleased that David is here. David is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. And David was born legally blind and grew up in the West Kootenays, a region in the southern interior of British Columbia. And the traditional territory, now you're going to help me out with David. Do I know how to say that? I don't.
The first one's Ktunaxa.
Okay.
The K is almost silent. And the other one, I always say it wrong. It's like Sinixt. Sit or something like it. I always get it. I apologize. I know it because the Canadian government had decided that nation didn't exist until the other half of that nation that was across the border in the south made a case like you can't say we're extinct, because of a border you made 100 years ago. So I like to include that because I think it's a powerful story about we're actually here, whether you want to believe it or not, or make a law about it or not. So I'm sorry that I don't have the correct pronunciation. I'll put it in the Google Doc that I'll share.
Well,
Apologies.
you're better than I. So that's great. But your dissertation, Seeing Otherwise, and what a great way to start that. Nature, Blindness, Memoir. You examine the blind minority and nature memoirs via close reading practices. To evidence how blind, intersectional, and ecological sensibilities can promote a just political and environmental collectives. You have an interdisciplinary background in literature, education, and the environmental humanities. And your intersectional teaching and research promotes the value of and strategies for creating practices of mutual vulnerability, care, and resilience. I love that in the face of a climate crisis. Okay, so David, welcome. And we've got 11 people with us so far, and I'm going to watch as more people join us, but take it away.
Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored. It's nice to meet all of you. As Pam said in my intro, I am legally blind. I have some vision, but I'm really nearsighted, colorblind, and light sensitive. So that's why I'm pretty squinty. So if I hide a little bit behind my very large monitor, that's why. I have on the share screen, I just use a Word doc. I'm pretty low tech, which I'll use for you to follow along with. Please don't worry about needing to take too many notes. I have, as you'll see, a Google Doc link that I'll post just before the end of the session, or maybe I'll just post it now. So that you can go there. I would recommend going maybe on Sunday once I've had a chance to update my resources. I got a little bit behind. I apologize for that, but all of this will be there, and I'll also take some notes as we go along. My plan for today was to sort of see, how many people were here and what you'd like to talk about specifically. I wasn't sure if it'd be a really large group or not, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience of disability with education and being and learning about nature. Really briefly, I wanted to go through a few definitions around what do we mean when we say disability, inclusion, or accessibility, and where do those come from, and most importantly, what do they leave out, I think. And towards the key takeaways that I'm hoping that we can focus on mostly is around looking at disability less as a way of a problem or a student who, I know, having been legally blind my whole life, how sometimes showing up in the classroom as an obstacle to the teacher's ability to manage the class. And so being a problem and also being an individual problem. And so one of the key takeaways I'm hoping we can start discussing today is that disability actually can be a strength and a really important perspective, especially around our shared vulnerability right now to the environment that the two speakers this morning spoke of so well. Also, I wanted to emphasize how disability offers a sense for different thinking around collectivity, especially in my dissertation, which happy to talk about if anyone has questions, but this isn't an academic panel, so I won't go on and on about that. But how non-dominant sensoriums, like how the way we notice the world because of our how we're taught, and humans have eyes that face forward, and we get a lot of information from our eyes. But thinking about our other senses and how students with disabilities have all kinds of interesting perspectives and sensations of the world that they bring with them, that again provide one of those avenues of strength-based noticing of nature and relationship forming, and also the value of learning slowly. And overall, to have this conversation to foster a sense of mutual, vulnerability. Like we all are vulnerable to nature and what happens to it, and we share in that. And we also have some mutual responsibilities to each other, and hopefully through sort of reimagining some of these definitions of what do we mean by including students with disabilities, what do we mean by providing access, we might think differently about our sense of care. I have a small case study we could use, but also I'd be very happy to know if you have specific instances in your own teaching where you've had challenges or struggles or successes with this topic. I'd really love for us to share about those, and then hopefully some time for discussion. I'm happy to take questions anytime. And just so you know that because of my visual impairment, I can't see the hand raising function very well. So Pam, if you could let me know if there's a question, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat window. And yeah, but just shout out anytime.
I will interrupt you as needed in terms of the chat. And we've just reposted your link to this document. And as you said, you'll be updating some of the things. Perhaps we'll start with your story, and then we have 12 of us here. So it would be great to then get us involved. We've got options.
Great. So I just, I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but, sometimes educators like to have like the backstory of, students with disabilities that survived. I've been through every kind of education you can imagine. As I said, I'm legally blind. There's a definition of my particular condition there. I've been in infant development, preschool programs, K-12, undergraduate, master's, now a PhD, every kind of education you can imagine. And what's interesting for me, this particular life circumstance, I grew up in the interior of British Columbia in the Kootenay region. I grew up on a farm, a butcher farm, and I was involved in everything from slaughtering and butchering animals to feeding them, manure, gardens, feeding animals, playing with animals, in the woods, all of it, camping, hiking, scouts, the whole 9 yards. And what I've noticed that's really interesting about this is, compared to my experiences of education, as I said in my little bit of an intro there, often teachers would know about my disability before they'd even ever met me because of my individual education programs and the way that all of that worked. And again, I was talking with Pam at the beginning of when we were just sorting things out. I have had the benefit and the luck of having many great teachers. It's often been that the institutions have made it difficult, or because of the policies that are in place, have made it a bit harder for me to feel like my presence was a strength or a value to the rest of the classroom. Often I was made to feel, like I said, anticipated before I arrived, that my blindness was often communicated to me as a sort of strangeness or a difference at best, and worst case scenario as an obstacle to my learning, and sometimes even a nuisance to the teachers or the school. Particularly around this, as opposed to my relationships with being on a farm where I was involved in everything and being out in nature in different, activities I did as a kid, I was sort of made to feel that I needed to be independent, that it was an individual problem, and I was trained to be self-sufficient, which made it so that I often didn't out myself about my blindness. I would hide it and pass as best as I could, which was often detrimental to me. Stigma around disability is something I wanted to emphasize is real. Anyway, blah, blah. One thing I wanted to just think about, and I know this isn't a perfect example for the fact that many of you probably work in urban settings. You have a big group of students, often of the same age. I'm sure you all have different experiences with students and students with disabilities and different ranges of students with disabilities. But there was just this one story where in my later scouting years, we did this activity called Night Trek. And it was a moment that I wanted to bring up as a memory of a time where I felt my blindness was just such a, was a strength and was appreciated, but also I didn't have to, it wasn't like a celebration of David's blindness or anything, you know, like that. It was an activity where you'd have 4 campers, 2 senior, 2 junior, a mix of genders, and because it was a scouts and guiding activity. It was called Night Trek. And because it was at night, and because I have low vision, and because I'm very light sensitive, I can see very well in the dark, even without a flashlight in the woods. And part of what made our group win every year, I think, was I could give us a whole bunch of advantages for speed. Me and the senior members of my teams were always really adamant that no one left behind. We always wanted the junior campers to have fun, to feel involved, to feel that their knowledge was valued. They got to know about my blindness. We all shared in like our nature knowledge. It was an outdoor activity. And I think we won every time because we had a sense of mutual responsibility to each other, even though it would be easy for the junior campers to feel like a burden or that they were dragging us behind. It'd be easy for me to feel like, oh, you know, my blindness is, I trip too much or whatever, you know, especially when I'd encounter someone's bright flashlight, then I'd be down for the count. But it was just as I was preparing for this workshop, I was just thinking that that was a moment where a lot of things came together in terms of making a space where disability and age difference and mutual care and trying to accomplish something together really became something like Sarah was saying in her talk about, you know, emphasizing, you know, laughter and finding fun in the face of while learning about nature and working with each other. So anyway, just that's very brief, but I'm really curious. Did anyone want to talk about things that are important to them in terms of this conversation, things that they were hoping to touch on, or obstacles or challenges that you've encountered in your own teaching, you know, around this issue of idea of disability and environmental education before we get into definitions?
Awesome. So I just want to open the floor. So you can unmute, you can put in the chat. But David, it's interesting how, you know, we talk about the system and how teachers would see you as from a deficit model and even as a burden for your class. And I think that often happens. My daughter's a teacher candidate right now, and she has a grade 2-3 class she's working with. And it seems like the culture in the school doesn't want to identify anyone because that means more work. And so they'd rather just push them under the carpet in a sense. And it's so disheartening. Anybody else want to add about the story about inclusion and disability, your own experiences, students you've worked with?
I was going to put it in the chat, but I figure this might be a little quicker to just say it out loud. It's just like, I've been having my research project is about bringing outdoor education and the intersection of special education together. So I've been having some conversations with specifically parents just to get a scope about their thoughts around bringing their children outdoors. And I think something that's come up that I hadn't really fully considered was the safety concerns about being outdoors. So I think that would be really interesting to talk a little bit about too.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Catherine. And Cara, I think you've got a thought.
Yes, thank you, Pam. Thank you, David, for bringing up the idea we can teach with looking at strengths in the full diversity of all our students. You also mentioned the concept of time and to slow down teaching to be able to be fully inclusive and use all our super strengths. So I wanted to acknowledge that and also wonder if you could expand on that a bit. If there was an example of how slowing down to meet student needs rather than, for example, curriculum needs through the school year, where that worked well for you.
Yeah, great question. And both those, I love them both. Yeah, the idea of safety. I saw an article actually online when I was researching for this. It looked like a MEd or other kind of research paper, a similar thing about special ed and nature education. I'll put it in the links for sure. And I love the question about time and slowing down. I have a few examples in my head I can offer about that, I think. Any other
Yes, I have a question as well. Just disclosure that my kids are just leaving the house, so it might be a little noisy in the background.
No problem.
But I have experience, I'm a teacher candidate right now, and formerly worked as an educational resource worker who would be somebody that provided assistance to children who needed extra support for varying reasons. But I also have a background in disability studies. And so I found that that perspective and how I worked with students really heightened my awareness of teachers' resistance to approaching these, I don't even know how you would say it, like a higher level of involvement and providing these experiences for children's with any type of disability. And I think also the previous person talking about asking how to slow down. I also know with school boards, when they need to push things like policies surrounding inclusion and accessibility, it's like an online workshop that's really almost meaningless, and people just click through it and oftentimes are multitasking and not really even paying attention to the content. So I just wondered on your thoughts of how this could come to be, where it's something that teachers actually have to be mindful of in their practice and not just sort of like a board pushed sort of workshop that they have to do.
That's a great question. Just in the sake of, those are all really great. Just in the sense of time, would it be okay if I think I might answer a few questions to the my sense of how to sort of explode some of the policy informed definitions, and then perhaps we could start thinking of how to apply some practices. Would that be okay with the group? I don't want to cut anyone off if there's other things people want to share.
Great. Our chat is full of yeses.
Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So yeah, as the last person said, I'll talk through these things, but what is disability? What is inclusion? What is access? And I agree with you. As I was saying, in my experience of K to 12, and a lot of the time it was clear to me that the policies that were being promoted were about covering the butts of the institution, right? That either a student is too disabled, right? That they should be put in an educationally specific institution, say for the blind or for the deaf or hard of hearing or that sort of thing. Or if they are allowed to be in a normal regular school, there's this like kind of tension around, well, if you're in this school, you have to kind of keep up on your own. And like I said, my experience was often of realizing I have to individually do this. No one, like the extra efforting that's going to be done has to be on my behalf and my parents' behalf. And in my own case, in the small rural place catchment, educational catchment that I was in, it was unfortunate because we had, when I was starting school, we'd had enough students who were blind or visually impaired to have an itinerant teacher for the blind who would go from school to school and provide us resources, and was just like so skilled, so specifically trained to assist us and help us learn how to be blind, like successfully blind, as opposed to how to act sighted and make do. But because of certain students leaving and one student passed away, unfortunately, there was not enough funding to make that happen, so she was removed. So in around grade 3 or so, that was lost to me. So when I was creating this workshop in terms of definitions, I wanted to think of like, what do we mean when we talk about disability? Because I think the first point that's so important, especially now with climate crisis and climate change and all the important points that both Richard and Sarah talked about in the opening talk this morning, Disability is a lot vaster than we think. We're often made to understand that the effect of disability itself is about sort of ableist oppression of society, but an individual impairment, right? But this way of understanding disability often leaves out the idea that there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to disabling effects, or what some people call debility, than others due to racism, environmental injustice, pollution, etc., crime, poverty, that it is individual and social, but like they are obviously real, but how they come to matter and are experienced is socially mediated. So in terms of points about what is the meaningful curriculum that can be done versus the policy, what about slowing down, what about ideas of safety? Like if we don't think about disability as relational, like for example, in the forest, I still can't see red, right? But I also don't have to drive a car, and I don't have to necessarily read print. There are specific ways that the specific historical, social, cultural society I live in makes my disability seem more or less important. One of my favorite authors, Georgina Klieg, talks about this. In a different time and place, people with a low vision like me, who are visually impaired, quote unquote, legally blind, as mandated by a governmental definition, in another time and place, my visual impairment might not even be that noticeable. So there's a way in which that disabilities are, I think, a lot more prevalent than we think. How they come to matter is culturally and socially specific. There can be a lot of stigma attached, and I think the place to start for me is about thinking about disability as a form of relationship. It can be a good one, it can be a bad one, it can be respectful, it can be disrespectful, it can decrease stigmatism, it can increase it. And if we are just approaching them from the sense of policy, as you were all brilliantly pointing out, I think that's going to be very detrimental to any kind of sense of real inclusion for students and anyone else with a disability involved in education. So again, yeah, you were anticipating this, if the idea of inclusion is who is present and can we just get more people in the room, I think that first of all, that does not really attend to what do people do when they arrive, right? There was a lot of times where I was involved, but because I didn't want to stand out, like, oh, David, go stand closer to the TV screen, you don't want to stand out as a student with a disability in a way that makes you look different, right? If the sense is that my being there meets the policy and that's good enough, but doesn't actually attend to what does it mean for me to be there and participate, that's not really inclusion. And I think this is a place to begin thinking about students with disabilities have a value and strengths that they can bring. And that question of slowing down, for example, often, when a contribution, one of you were saying about reading about disability studies, one contribution that disability studies scholars have made is that often when we do things that for quote unquote the disabled originally, say like closed captioning or descriptive audio or ramps, we start to see how those things have a benefit for many people. It's not just wheelchair users that use ramps, it's also the elderly who walk slow. It's also parents who have baby strollers. It's better on everyone's knees, that kind of thing. There's a larger mutual benefit that starts to occur if we begin to think of as inclusion as not so much as including people who are problems and don't fit, but more as making space for what they bring. And in terms of access, again, which I think is similar to inclusion, but a bit different because it's about access is sort of, okay, you got there and maybe you got into the space, but what does it mean to, you were included and then you got through the door, but, maybe at the rudimentary level, it's, are the materials suitable for the students' ability to read or access them, that kind of thing. But again, when it's done in a policy-based way, it doesn't, it often fails to actually address things like stigma, a sense of mutual responsibility to one another around providing access. And also the thing I want to emphasize is that these, both inclusion and access, if they're always considered as like a ticking a policy box or something we do after we've created our curriculum, they're never going to succeed, because they don't assume from the start what it means to have that kind of mutual relational like care and attention and seeing each other as bringing something of value, right? I don't teach in K-12, but I do a lot of undergraduate education. I've done a lot of teaching with international students in another life at UBC when I was doing my undergrad and my master's. And, any good educator knows, like, you learn a lot from the students too. But if it's a top-down application of material that doesn't anticipate what the students bring, you're always going to run into conflict. Does that start to answer some of the questions that you had at the start? Is that helpful?
I'm also just going to bring you up to speed on the chat. So we've got the idea of universal design, curb cutting as an example, and I think that's great, thinking right from the beginning. And Jessie adds that her instructor frequently uses the phrase necessary for some, good for all, and really keeping that in mind.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
And Danielle adds that, yeah, that's starting to address sort of how we can go deep in mindfulness by starting right from the beginning and valuing the different experiences, right? When we're planning, you're right, not like a Band-Aid at the end.
Exactly. Thank you all. Great stuff. So, and again, in that sense of slowing down and the necessary for some, good for all, what I like about the sense of slowing down is often because disabilities can be so invisible, right? Like often when we think of disability, we think of a person with a cane or a dog, a person who has visible hearing aids, a person that we can see in a wheelchair or with crutches, or some sort of, what do you call it, like tool that they're using that signals their disability. And we're using vision, again, a dominant, ocular centric sense to determine who is not able-bodied. But as the speakers talked about today, climate trauma and, climate change induced stress and anxiety, eco-anxiety, and all the different, I'm sure all of you have either encountered or experienced, or, some of you mentioned you have kids, like things like, that are just pathologized or called disabilities around behavioral differences, neurological or learning differences, or like me, where, I can pass in familiar environments as sighted, but I'm only pretending to look at you. I'm not actually seeing you. There's all kinds of ways that disability becomes invisible. And I think if we think about our classroom as a space where we should anticipate disability being as opposed to add it on, the idea of slowing down, for example, is often good for many students, like to go through a lesson or go through an experience that, someone who maybe is a bit hard of hearing but not diagnosed, or someone who has a learning disability and takes time to process, again, not diagnosed, or maybe they are, but it's a stigma, so they don't like to talk about it. Often slowing down the pace of something, and I think especially with experiences around talking about relationships to nature, noticing nature, and thinking about what is our relationship to it, taking the time to emphasize it and experience it together really matters. So like I said, in this workshop, I think something to think about then is like when planning curriculum, as opposed to the tick the box or the afterthought, if we think about it as something that many of us experience or are going to experience by age-related, disability, or people in our own lives, it's a collective experience. And I think, though I hesitate to say how, to explicitly say how to like, to be careful how one emphasizes this, depending on the age of the students, etc. But, sometimes I feel more vulnerable to something like, say, COVID, or more vulnerable to different environmental effects because I have less information, and it'll be assumed that I might see something and I don't. So in terms of like safety and the collective experience of things, I think it's important to think about how it affects us all. Often people with disabilities, it's going to affect more, and they may already have experienced, deleterious environmental effects that have, exacerbated or created their disability in the first place. As I said, it can be often hidden and visible. Like, again, these are some ways I want us to think about disability differently. Often there is a sense of self-imposed, societal imposed stigma. It could be about self-preservation or trying to hide it because it's just more safe, etc. So not to be, to remember that often disability is there even when we don't, especially when we don't see it. And just to emphasize again, I think as the two speakers did, but just, environmental racism and its impact on racialized people, individuals, communities. Often there's a lot more different kinds of disability present in communities that are already disadvantaged or oppressed to begin with. And that's something to remember. And as opposed to just impairments that are classically identified through governmental bodies, et cetera, as, mobility impairment, sensorial impairment, intellectual impairment, things that are easily measurable and often very easy to see. I think a lot of what you might be all encountering is, trauma-based, mental health-based, depression, anxiety, toxic environmental influences of disability. Those are likely more prevalent and common and more likely to be in your classroom than the classic sort of severe individual case, because we live in, I'm guessing you teach mostly in North America, in Canada, a lot of childhood illnesses and that sort of thing. We've eradicated many kinds of like common visual impairments, for example. Mine's genetic and very rare. So just something to think about there. Any questions so far?
Okay, so at this point, I think we're all soaking it in.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
We have a question, David. I just wondered what your thoughts or take on would be in terms of when you think of deficit thinking and how you want to create that that role of showing or having people understand, like you were saying, there's positives that students with or people with disabilities can offer within the classroom and reframing that concept. But how do you also then include, sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought here,
No
but
problem.
I guess on the practical point of things, like, how do you also make sure that it's not like those are ignored and that you incorporate it into one, that the practical piece of making sure those accommodations are made, but also shifting the mind frame of thinking as disability as a positive?
Right. So, I mean, one thing that I've thought about often is this exact example or this exact question. And, there's a school I've heard of, and again, I think we can scale this down to a more everyday way, but in my own experience, first of all, I was taught to type from age 4 or 5, and I was often taken out of class to do so. So this was because it was understood that if I was going to go on in my education, if I wasn't able to write very quickly, I would never keep up in my studies. And again, to be independent. And then later in my master's degree, disability studies and environment is my, graduate research, right, as a PhD student now. But in my master's degree, when I was studying disability studies for one of the first times, I encountered this school that it wasn't a specifically like for disabled students education program, but what they did was so unique, I thought. So if they ever had a class where there was a student who was deaf or hard of hearing, everyone learned a little ASL as a way to show that, like, to sort of normalize, to teach it as a strength. And the students loved it because then they're like, oh, we can communicate and pass notes to each other, and the teacher doesn't even know what we're saying about them. Like, they found it to be really fun, especially in the younger ages. Like, oh, I didn't realize there's these other ways of communicating. And I know all of you, in terms of like practical solution, pressed for time, but I think that can be scaled down to even say, we're going to learn, hi, how are you? Or just one word or something like that. And because it's that tension, right, where you don't want to deficit model, like kind of erase or invisibilize a student with disability, but also, and I know from my own experience and talking with other people who've made it through K-12 with disabilities, we also don't want to be put on the spot and put in a spotlight. So it is a bit of a tension for sure. But my sense is like each student is different, But if you give students opportunities to talk about vulnerability as something that is not shameful, and if that's sort of a like thinking sort of to answer your student about practicality, I think it means sort of backing up the approach that of like Sarah was saying today about emotion. You know, with students, like we often think of disabilities as somehow shameful or stigmatized because vulnerability cannot be a strength, right? If someone is weak, that must be something we should try to fix all the time. But I think if we can find, you know, it'll be different with each student and different kinds of disabilities, but, you know, allowing students to be different and to be able to express that difference a bit, or the way that they notice things differently, you know, just even, for example, the way I'm visually impaired, that like, I use a cane, especially when I'm in a really unfamiliar place. But when I'm somewhat familiar, you know, in my own little neighborhood and I walk the dogs, I can't have a cane and both hands full, but I'm looking down a lot and at the dogs. And it's amazing what you'll notice when you're looking down as opposed to up. And just that slight shift gives me a whole different view of my neighborhood. And I'll say things to my partner that he won't have noticed because that's not where he's looking. You know, the perspective from a wheelchair, the perspective from, you know, having a different sensorial mode of being in the world. These can all be ways to start to tease out and pull out practical applications. I think also when you can get a sense of buy-in with students of working together who are different, and understanding that, like, yes, you have time, like you have more time to do things like as a group, and that it's about doing it together. It can't just be like one swift, fast person does it. Everyone has to do it together, and there's value in accomplishing it together and making sure everyone's included. Am I answering your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, I just saw that. Yeah, I wish I had too. You know, in fact, after my dissertation, my first plan is to learn the manual sign, like that's just by touch, that like Helen Keller used, for example. I think these are important skills that everyone should have. I just also, I've rambled too much. How much time do we have now?
We're 10:15 to 11:15, so it's 10:53.
Okay.
So you've got at least 20 minutes.
Okay, great. So let's see what I have here. Yeah, so I did say about the ASL thing here about the strength. That's just one example, but you know, the way that students who don't see very well, it's not that they have like, you know, better hearing. It's more often that they just use it differently. And again, when I was mentioning sensorial group slow learning, you know, it's really fun to do activities where, let's say, you know, even in an urban setting, you can do this, right? So where it seems like there is no nature, you know, like first take away as many sensations as you can. Get students to just focus on maybe what they can touch and smell near them. Like, you know, get them to plug their ears, get them to cover their eyes and just sit and be. First, they experience just the touch, like the texture and the smell of a place, right? It's hard. I mean, you could plug their noses, but that's a lot. And then let them remove their earplugs, right? So then what are they starting to hear? And make sure they're, you know, depending on the age, they may not be able to be quiet, but like, how do they experience the sound of the place? And move it up to vision as sort of like the last thing you really need to notice, right? Often students of all kinds, whether disabled or not, will realize how much they learn about a place through their other senses without having to use vision first. And I know this is very much like, you know, I'm blind, so that's why I go there. But the domination of sight over all our other sensations, I think, is very much a way in which we see how disabilities are a strength or not. And to me, those kinds of exercises where you can emphasize to students that there's a lot to learn by touching a leaf, for example, before you try to say more about it than all the other senses, and spending some time with it, you know, even noticing like where the grass grows on the sidewalks, what kinds of animals are around the school, because there always are. Even in an urban setting, there's raccoons, there's squirrels, there's crows, there's scavengers of all kinds, there's bugs, like, or the relationship of the, you know, the like pollution and that sort of thing in an urban setting is an important facet of noticing the environment, right? That's just another one there. sorry. And so yeah, so again, collective multi-sensorial slow. And I think again, giving students, if they feel up to it, especially with disabilities, a chance to, like if you kind of scale up to vision, for example, in that exercise, I think there's a way to make, say, a student who's blind or deaf feel comfortable in saying, oh, well, I notice vibration this way. I notice sound this way. Because the whole group is doing it and sharing, they don't have to stand out so much. And again, if possible, I think it's really important to engender in students, like, I'm not sure, because I'm not a K-12 teacher, I don't want to prescribe, but a sense of being responsible to each other, and not like in a pity way, right? Like, oh, David, you have to always sit with Pam, because Pam is going to make sure that you don't fall and trip and whatever, get to class, that kind of thing. But more like, communicating ways in which that they will benefit from shared learning and taking care of one another, especially if you have classes with different age ranges. I think that's so essential, especially for them to get a sense of how does our human senses of mutual care and responsibility translate into how we are responsible to and dependent on and vulnerable to the natural world, would be what I'd say. I am just thinking that if we only have 20 minutes, I think it might be more effective. I rambled a bit too long, I'm sorry. But I'd be really interested to know, do you have questions? Can I expand more? Are there things you want to talk about specifically? I know that practical concepts are super important when you're actually faced with students. What do you do? So I think that might be more like easier for our time than doing the breakout rooms at this point. I'm sorry for the time. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, and just to let you know, it's 10:57, so we go right to 11:15.
Okay.
I just, while we're just sort of switching, just want to add, those of you who are familiar with Joseph Cornell's work, Sharing Children in Nature, he's the one that uses a thing called a camera, where you have kids, open and close their eyes, or touch, or using senses differently. And then, of course, Stephen Mader's acclimatization stuff. One of my favorites is his sort of cocktail, where you give kids a little glass or a little container and they collect scents, and then they make it into and then they name it, like well, for adults we would use cocktail hour, but for kids we often use ice cream flavor, a new ice cream flavor. And so yeah, so Danielle's got a question, but others as well. Danielle, go for it.
Hi, David. Again, it's more of from a practical standpoint. When you were talking about that resource lady that you had up until grade 3, teaching you how to thrive being blind versus trying to make you fit in. Was she blind? Did I miss that part?
No, she was not. Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, like, how do we access that perspective without kind of being intrusive and sort of, like you said, putting students on the spot? Like, I find it a sensitive area where I don't want to overburden them, because they're often children and I don't want to over ask questions, I guess, or not knowing their level of comfortability. So how do we promote that from like a practical standpoint? Like, I know we can read literature and all of that and get like our thinking to be including EDI, but from a practical standpoint, like tips to navigate things when you're seeing not visually impaired.
Yeah, great question. So that's a great question. So my itinerant teacher for the blind and visually impaired, her name was Susan, and she was great, and she had a master's degree in that field. It was amazing what she knew. I actually did my master's degree looking at all the archives, like all the material my mom had saved around trying to argue with the school board for funding for me and that sort of thing. And what was to answer your question though, what's interesting is that, like, as I said, I so often felt this implicit sense of like, if I ask for too much, it always slows down the class and stops the class. And the teacher is already trying to deal with a lot of students, right? And it's not that I was the worst student, but there was like, there's always behavioral issues and conflicts between students and that sort of thing. But one thing I would recommend is, and that I did not get until much later in life, was invite in speakers, say like the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or different deaf and hard of hearing services. They always have community outreach, and people who and let them know, like, you want to have kind of a sense of like being in the world, but not to like further stigmatize, or not a freak show, but to have people come in and talk about their experience as adults. Many kids think they're alone in their experience of disability. They don't have mentors, they don't have people with similar experiences, and each disability is different. But often, again, because we live in a society where we are able to get rid of so many illnesses that cause disabilities when children are younger, we also don't have generally like inherited shared differences. So even deaf parents might have hearing kids, and hearing adults may have deaf children. So there's not this way that, like, say, because that's the thing, it's not the same, say, as inheriting your parents' racial or ethnic background, or like those sorts of things. It's not the same kind of trait passing. So I would definitely say that in a practical way, if you have even a small budget, or maybe they'll do it for free, but there's always local agencies. Like, there's national ones, and they almost always have sub-agencies, especially if you're teaching in Toronto or anywhere near it. There's tons of agencies that do outreach around disability and awareness, and about, like, what's it like to be an adult with a disability. It's not all bad. I think you have to sort of pick the right people. I've been at events where I wanted to go, and I'm gay, right? So I've been at conferences around talks that were supposed to be like sexuality and disability, and I'm like, wow, this will be so great. And then it was just this unending litany of how hard it was to get a date when you're disabled. I'm like, this is not the conversation I wanted to have. I don't feel inspired. So you're clearly not going to go that route with depending on the age of the students, but I just mean that inviting people in, and so that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting about destigmatizing the experience, could be a really helpful practical application. And many of those agencies, because they're NGOs and have external funding, especially if it's for educational purposes, they may not even charge. I'm not quite sure, but that would be one suggestion. Is that a helpful response, Danielle?
Yes, thank you very much.
And it looks like there's another one here by Kara. Do you want to talk about it more, Kara? Kara?
Well, I was just thinking, as you were talking about, effective techniques, I think, and slowing down, I think just one practical point I've noticed is that it benefits to take the time, like we go through learning experiences, we can have people use different senses. And then sometimes the time factor, we've got to go to lunch, and our debrief gets cut off. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important. I like how you brought up, there is a deeper, richer learning, and including making sure the students are involved as a community and learning how to learn together, as they're going to learn, to live together with all kinds of different people. So that's one thing that I've noticed over years, is to make sure to take that time. If it gets cut off, or a bell that rings or whatever, make sure it does happen later. And I've learned from students quite a lot in those exchanges, when what they noticed, and that can be different, and to celebrate, not to be looking for the right or the wrong answer, the observations that you were hoping that they would make, but being open to, and both in, like, as we're exploring the environment, but any kind of topics, opening them up to that there's times when we're going to exchange where there is no right or wrong answer, and that we're learning from each other's responses that way. So yeah, just one thing that I had thought of.
I love that. I love that, especially the idea of not right or wrong answers and having the time to, like that, again, the slowing down aspect to really give students time to reflect. And I think also in this regard, I've found if you embroider an assignment, so I know that you have all kinds of curriculum pressures, so I'm sorry if any of these suggestions are absolutely like, David, what are you talking about? I have to meet certain goals or the ministry will fire me. But for example, in my own work teaching in university, often I try to structure the overall assignments for the entire term so that it's just kind of one idea, really, and then students have several opportunities to engage with that topic. So they do sort of a reflection. They might expand it into a mini lit review, like what are 5 different discussions of that topic, and then they could weave it into an essay, or do a little presentation on it or whatever. But they haven't really changed their idea. They've had more and more time to make their ideas nuanced, because there's, like you said, that it's not about a right or wrong answer. It's about giving them a chance to have some emotional and intellectual depth with the topic. I also wanted to say, I totally forgot, I was thinking about it this morning, another really neat way to do disability in nature, because they're seen as so oppositional, like I think Sarah was mentioning, like the way that it's like human versus nature, these colonial Enlightenment ideas that, man dominates over the natural world, has all these different, sexist connotations too. But some really great academic work I've read has done some really beautiful work, kind of academic artistry work, where students go out into the world, and especially in urban settings, I think this is can be more poignant too, but asking the students to find reflections of themselves in the world around them. So for example, there was one student who had burn scars, and she was super, felt a lot of self-loathing and stigma and that sort of thing attached. But as soon as she had encountered some burned trees and their scarring, and also the way, and then learning about how the trees cope with that kind of unsurprising fires or whatever, it was a way for her to talk about a shared sense of vulnerability with nature, and a way of feeling less, quote unquote, ugly in her words, right? But a way for students to see their differences reflected around them, and not just ugly, but also as, insight into maybe how the world could be treated differently, how the natural world and the human world is so connected, and sometimes very painful and very vulnerable. But being able to find aspects of nature that reflect them a little bit, that can be a really fun activity too. And having the time to use that as an artifact through the term, say, I don't know, but that sense of seeing themselves in the nature too, and finding something that represents them and being able to talk about it, whether it's about disability difference or not, but I found that kind of activity, letting students do a little bit of anthropomorphic work, isn't always bad, I found. Go ahead.
David, can you hear me? It seems
Yeah.
that my computer has frozen a bit.
Oh.
So I'm so glad you can hear me, because I can't even change the mute. I can't type, but just want to let you know that there's it's 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay. Catherine, connections.
It's me. It's my computer.
Oh, that's okay. Catherine had a point in the chat.
Yeah, I was just talking about your earlier point about how we have all of these ministry mandates in the curriculum, but I often one of my profs was talking about how it sometimes is just easier to think of a big idea like inclusion and then go into the curriculum and find those connections there, and it's a lot easier to do that than you might think it is. So
yeah, thank you. That's a hopeful point. Yeah, I mean, overall, all I really wanted to share with you today, and I really appreciate all your engagement too, but just that idea of yeah, like if we, one of the biggest things I learned in my first explorations of disability studies was the realization that like, oh, for so many of us, you know, the disabled, people of color, you know, women through so much of, you know, educational history, anyone who is different, it's always this like surprise, like, how did you get here? But as educators, especially around an idea of like, who is going to be inheriting and living in this world that is really buggered up, you know, with pollution and climate change, how do we teach like, you know, sort of the respect for one another and for the environment differently? I really think there's a lot to be said for sort of anticipating that you're going to have students that learn in very different ways, experience the world in different ways, and need that time to engage and have actually a lot to share. And if it's sort of seen as an advantage, like that we slow down together, like no one left behind as you move through curriculum, that can really change how the students feel about what they bring. You know, students love to have a sense of responsibility, I find. And being blind, even I've had to use Zoom so much because of COVID. My students love being the one who's like, David, there's a hand up. Oh, David, can I read the chat window today for you? Or like that kind of thing. You know, and they're like, you know, early 20s, but they have this like almost, you know, not, I don't want to say childlike, I don't want to infantilize them, but they have this like real excitement about it, even though it's like, thank you. It's like, it's an accommodation for me, but they feel really involved. So I just, that was the sort of message I wanted to say today, that there's so many ways of experiencing and being with the world. We're all very vulnerable in it. I think there's a deep connection between what people with disabilities know and how the world is coping with climate change and environmental disaster. And the more we can kind of emphasize that from a place of mutual vulnerability, responsibility, and care, I think the better. And like I said, I gave the Google link. I'll add more thoughts and stuff into this document by the end of the weekend. So check it out then. But it was nice to meet all of you and have a conversation today. I hope it was helpful.
Thanks, David. Again, I hope that you can hear me. I'm just looking at my frozen screen. So thank you everybody for coming. Again, I put in the chat David's work that he's included with us. David, I've written down so much. I like the slow learning approach, what insights are to be gained by asking and listening to students, and really normalizing, or as you said, like an inclusionary approach. And I just love that. And no one left behind. Just so great to have that, because, you know, when we think about diversity, sometimes the ability diversity gets left behind. We think of race in this time of Black Lives Matter, and that's important, but to really expand the conversation. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to try and end the meeting now so the recording gets saved. But David, if for some reason I leave and you become host, you get to end the meeting.
Got it.
Okay. Bye, everyone. And we'll see you at the next session at 11:30.